Hello, I'm Robert Banks, author of the book Warriors and Warships, which is a history of Point Fredrick.
And I'm Sue Baisley, an archaeologist who's contributed to our knowledge of this place by digging in the ground.
We're lucky today to be standing on a location in Kingston, Ontario, near Fort Henry, where Prime Minister Alexander Mackenzie stood in June of 1874. Prime Minister Mackenzie was here because he wanted to find a location for a military college for the new Dominion of Canada. Eventually, he chose Point Fredrick.
Together, Bob and I invite you to join us on a tour of this place. A place where ships were built by French shipwrights and British shipwrights, and contributing to the development of Canada.
We can still find evidence of this history on the grounds, and today, please come with us and we'll show you some of that evidence.
So we're now on Point Fredrick, and this area that we see here has been used for thousands of years by Indigenous peoples, long before the French and the British came here. When we were doing archaeology in 2004 to construct this building, a new cadet dormitory, we found evidence of Indigenous use of this land. We have evidence of a seasonal hunting camp, and materials related to stone tool making. And you can see on this slope, and it was a much steeper slope, the slope led down to a little shallow bay. And we also found indications of wooden posts along here, which we believe related to a hunting technique for deer. So it would relate to corralling the deer, driving them down this steep slope and into the shallow bay where the animals would be much more easily killed. So we know that Indigenous peoples were here for a very long time and using this area. And now we're going to move over to the location of the Provincial Marine.
In the fall of 1783, Major John Ross and Captain David Beaton met here, right here, likely in the Limonade, a provincial marine vessel offshore. Before that time, Point Fredrick was uninhabited. They were interested in building a wharf, this one as it turned out, in order to have a transshipment point to offload goods going further west. And this was it. This was considered an ideal location. Later on, after building this wharf, the foundation for this wharf, during the winter of 1783-84, they built some supply houses just down the beach further, and that allowed brigades of bateaux from Montreal. It allowed them to place their bateaux, the individual boats, on the shoreline together. It was René Laforce, a French Canadian, who actually built this. It has been here ever since in one form or another. And it was here during the War of 1812 where everything happened. Every provincial marine vessel that was built at this dockyard, including the Speedy from York that was lost in Lake Ontario, every one of them was built here and rigged here on this deck, except for the St. Lawrence, which we'll talk about later. This is truly a historic place and truly an important part of Canadian history. We are in the center of the old Provincial Marine Navy location, just about in the center. This was a dockyard that was built in 1790, and ships were first built here in 1792. It had a palisade fence that ran around it. It went from the old marine wharf that we've just looked at to over just about 100 yards that way. In behind were buildings, some of them made of log, some frame buildings that housed the officers' mess, quarters for some of the workers, but most of the sailors lived on board the ships, which would have been arrayed out here and anchored or moored in the Navy Bay. The Provincial Marines served Upper Canada for some years before the War of 1812. But when the War of 1812 came along, life here changed, and this dockyard changed. It became a different place.
Here we have an example of something really exciting that we've just been able to see. Never seen this before. And it's the remnants of slipway number 1 from that 1790s period of the dockyard. And we can see these really large timbers, parallel timbers, out into the water on a nice angle going towards the deep water. And this is where some of those early ships that were built here would have been launched from. So this is really exciting that we're able to see this with perfect weather and perfect conditions. And I've never seen this before in this particular spot. So this is really cool.
We're going to move from the Provincial Marine Dockyard to what that place looked like. We're going to talk about the War of 1812 next. Sue and I are standing at the southern tip of Point Fredrick in a little enclave called Fort Fredrick. It was here that a battery of artillery was placed during the early days of the War of 1812, and where the only battle that was fought in Kingston during that war occurred. The battle occurred when the Royal George was returning to port here, and it was pursued by 7 U.S. Navy warships, small warships. And as the half of the fleet of Navy warships passed a line that sort of joins where we are now to Kingston, once that line was passed, the batteries on both sides of the river opened fire and the battle began. It lasted an hour or two. There were about 3 men killed and about a dozen who were injured, and a few shots went into the town. When the battle was over, the U.S. Navy withdrew. They failed to achieve their objective, and that was the last we saw of that. But in anticipation of future battles, this fort was built in the 1840s, and but there are archaeological remains within this fort that Sue's going to explain to us next.
We're standing in the middle of Fort Fredrick. But at the start of the War of 1812, there was just a small gun battery at the end of the point. But it was quickly realized that there needed to be a greater defensive and offensive structure here. So a large blockhouse was built during the War of 1812, and you can see here in front of us, we have the remnants of the foundation. And this blockhouse was actually continued all the way back behind us, and so it was quite a large square structure. Now, in the 1960s, part of it was dug up, but we did some archaeology more recently in the 2000s, and we were able to uncover more parts of this behind us. But also you can see the large tower behind us is just the ongoing construction of defense that was needed in the 1840s.
Sue and I are standing on the football field, or it looks like a rugby field right now at RMC. This is the location of the headquarters of the Royal Navy, the commander. This was the Commander James Yeo, who was occupied a home and offices that were located right about here. This was a great location for him because he had the artillery battery and a sentry site out here. You can see what was going on in the lake. He had a wharf this way so he could get access to the commander at Fort Frontenac. Over by where today is Mackenzie Building was another building where his deputy, the commissioner, had an office. And then most importantly, the dockyard was right there right in front of him. And he could watch, when he came out each day, he could watch the ships rising. So this was truly well located. It was put up here, the building was here in 1813, disappears from records about in the 1840s. But it was a very, very important piece of ground, and the naval war in the Great Lakes was run out of a headquarters that was right here. From here, we're gonna move back and we're gonna go back to the dockyard and how it changed during the War of 1812. As the War of 1812 continued, there became a need for larger and more powerful warships. In fact, there was a builder's war on the Great Lakes. The United States Navy at Sackett's Harbor on the other side of the lake were furiously building warships. Well, here in Navy Bay, the Royal Navy were doing the same. A lot of the shipwrights that built these were French Canadians, as well as British shipwrights and Canadian shipwrights. And this is where they were built. The largest of these ships was the HMS St. Lawrence. It was larger than Lord Nelson's Victory, which many people see at Portsmouth Harbor. It's still around. The St. Lawrence needed to be berthed. And so this unusually large pier, called the St. Lawrence Pier, that we're standing on here today, was purposely built to allow the St. Lawrence to be housed and stored after the war. When the war ended, there was a need to store all of these military assets because it wasn't sure that another war wouldn't happen. The St. Lawrence was tied aside along this pier for 20 years on the north side, as I'm pointing to, and it sat there for 20 years before finally the prospect of war ended with the building of the Rideau Canal, and there was no further need for British warships on the lake, and it was towed away. So the yard underwent during the war an enormous expansion, and we're going to talk a little bit about that next, but first Sue's going to talk to us about the building behind the stone frigate.
This large stone building was built in 1820 after the War of 1812 to house various pieces of the warships that could no longer remain on board ship, such as the masts and the rigging. Eventually, it was also used to house sailors and soldiers as a barracks. The dockyard diminished in use and was closed, but by 1838, it was hurriedly reopened as a result of the rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada. The inside of this building was redone in order to look like a ship and to function as a ship, commissioned as HMS Niagara. Subsequent to that, the dockyard closed permanently, and this building was used to house the entirety of the small military college that opened in 1876. Eventually, the college grew to encompass all of the buildings on campus that we see today. These guns, there's two of them, one on either side of the gate, are from the Queen Anne period, about the beginning of the 1700s. They're British guns, obviously, Queen Anne. And how do we know this? Well, when this wall was rebuilt, the guns were taken out and we were able to see the ciphers on the top of the gun, the rose and crown, and that tells us that they're Queen Anne. Now, these guns were probably captured by the French at the Battle of Oswego, across the other side of the lake, and they were found at Fort Frontenac. They were placed here in the ground in order to protect the original wooden gateway entrance into the dockyard. They're huge, they're 8.5 feet long. They're smoothbore muzzle loading guns, and they're used as bollards basically. They've been here since about 1813. And so they really are the only artifacts that are left above ground from the War of 1812 period. On this hill behind us is where the shanty village for the workers of the dockyard eventually developed. There were hundreds of people working here during the War of 1812, building the warships. Not only the British shipwrights, but also French-Canadian shipwrights from Quebec City. And they were able to build their own shelters, their own houses, shanties on this slope. They were able to use the scrap wood from the yard, and they constructed small cabins about 14 feet to 20 feet in size. During the archaeology that we did here for the construction of this dormitory, we found remnants of several of these shanties. And at the base of the hill, we found an entire shanty. And we're fairly certain that that particular shanty was used by French Canadians because we found some small religious figurines in it. And next we're going to move over to the accommodations that replace these shanties, over to the naval cottages. These lines that we see in the ground are what archaeologists call crop marks. And they delineate a huge structure that was situated along the waterfront here, just outside the naval dockyard. These are the naval cottages that were built in 1822 to replace the shanties that the shipwrights lived in. Commodore Barry, who was in charge of the dockyard, had these structures built. There were 16 of them in a long row, all detached together in a terrace-like formation. And we were able to do archaeology here for a number of years to uncover a little bit of evidence about the people who were living here. It wasn't just the shipwrights who were here, it was also their families who lived in these naval cottages. There was a disastrous fire in 1868 when cottages 10 to 16, so the southern end of the cottages, burnt down. The remaining cottages stayed in use, and in fact, they were in use as residences for the staff of the Royal Military College until 1910, when they were eventually torn down. This area behind us where we see these buildings is where the Naval Hospital stood, in fact, in the fields beyond these structures. The Naval Hospital was a wooden building, and it was for all of the people who worked in the dockyard. So whether they were the results of casualties from the war or people who were injured or had health issues, they were in the hospital. We had an opportunity to do archaeology here to actually debunk the myth of the Commandant's house, this large limestone structure, which was for a long time thought to be the hospital. In fact, there is another building encased within this larger structure, which was the surgeon's quarters. So we do have another building, small building, limestone building beside that, and that was the cookhouse for the hospital.
We now depart Point Fredrick and take a visual aerial view along the back road and across the north campus of the Royal Military College of Canada. We cross near the site of a naval cemetery, while on the right we see the sports fields of the women and men cadets who trained to become future leaders of the Canadian forces and of Canada. Beyond the fields and to the right of the large white dome is a small section of road which extends up through the village of Berryfield. Once called the Point Road, it was the road taken by many wagons laden with wood from the forests and the mill to the north, all of it destined for Point Fredrick and the shipyards. Berryfield, which we pass over, was founded later. It was the home to many who worked in the yard and those who remained long after the departure of the Royal Navy. Some who stayed built a church, which we see ahead. It was built on land donated by someone who came from England with Commodore James Yeo in 1813 and remained behind. Our last stop on this tour is a visit to his home.
And finally, we end here in front of a house lived in by John Bennett Marks. John Bennett Marks came to Point Fredrick with James Yeo in 1813, and he worked at the yard for many years, retiring finally in 1845. And at times, he was the only employee when the yard got close to being closed or closed. John Bennett Marks owned the farm around us, the farmland, and being a very pious man, he donated an acre of land to his church, which is across the street. Some days, he and his wife Anne would have been able to sit out here on the veranda and look at the spire on the other side of the road from us. John Bennett Marks left his own mark. He had many accomplishments, and when he died in 1872, his body was brought here to the church, and he was laid to rest underneath the floorboards in a crypt. A bit unusual in Canada, but that's where he is today. He's on the high ground. He's on the ground that he would have been able to stand on and look back at the dockyard that he did so much to found many years ago.
It's been our pleasure to show you some of the discoveries that we've made at Point Fredrick and tell you about the history of this important place. And thank you for joining us.